So some of you may have wondered what progressive rock is. Well, if you've ever been flipping around on the dial of a radio and heard something on a rock station and thought, what is that? Well, that was probably prog rock. So as some of you may know, I have been a fan of a genre of music called progressive rock for several years. Some of my favorite artists such as Rush, Genesis, Pink Floyd, Yes, and others all fall under the umbrella of progressive rock. It may not be the most accessible genre compared to mainstream rock or pop music, but if you're interested in more instrumental based and longer, more complex composition songs, I think it can be really interesting and really enjoyable and rewarding to listen to. So that's why today on Crate Digging I'd like to take a moment to look at a couple of records from my Prog collection that have been in heavy rotation recently and which I really enjoy. So I'd like to start out with a classic. This is Fragile by Yes. Now, Yes is a very positive band because you can just answer yes whenever someone asks you what kind of music you listen to. And that may have been a terrible joke, but whatever. So Yes was really one of my first experiences with progressive rock. When I was a kid, my dad had two albums by Yes. One of them was 90125, which is their album from the 80s, which is much more mainstream pop influenced and much more radio friendly. That was the album that had Owner of a Lonely Heart on it, which is of course very well known song, gets a lot of radio play even to this day. So I really liked that. I really liked all the songs on that record, and I would play them a lot, and that was kind of what Yes was for me. Of course, my dad also had another record called Classic Yes, which was a greatest hits compilation of their earlier, much more progressive work. And that one I really couldn't get into because a lot of the songs were longer and more instrumental. You got things like Heart of the Sunrise on there, and other songs that, you'd listen to them and they wouldn't even start singing for the first 3 or 4 minutes, and I would think, what is this? What's the point of all this? Because at that time for me, music and rock music was about being driven by the vocals, the standard, verse, bridge, chorus structure of a song. So I didn't understand it. That's where my taste in music was when I was a kid. But as I gradually got older, I began to understand and appreciate more and more of what progressive rock acts like Yes were about, and really understand their musicianship and the composition of their work, because there really are complex compositions on albums like these. And one of the songs that really got me into this album in particular was their very famous song Roundabout, which when I was a teenager and I finally heard it in its complete version, the 8-minute version, on a classic rock station, I was really blown away by how sonically complex and how detailed and dynamic the music was, and it's not really like anything else that I'd heard. And not only that, but it really, really rocked. Like, there were some really hardcore solos on that song. So that really, I guess, woke me up to what Yes was doing, and really got me interested in more of the, shall we say, less accessible areas of progressive rock. So I was listening to Yes in smatterings off and on, and then in recent years I finally decided, I want this album and I want that song, Roundabout, so I decided to take the plunge and get this album. So this is one of their first records that I got myself, but of course I didn't actually buy the record first. I first got it on iTunes because that's what I was into at the time. I bought Roundabout on iTunes because I was only interested in that song, and as I listened to it I realized I really probably should hear the rest of this album and hear what they have to offer. So I got it on iTunes and I was listening to it there, and the sound composition was great. It was a remaster and they really took care of how they transferred it to digital. It's the remaster was really well done because they preserved a lot of the sonic dynamics and didn't compress the crap out of everything like some remasters do. So it still sounded really good. And then after a while when I started getting into vinyl again, well, I saw it in a record store when I was browsing this local independent record shop, and I was thinking, should I get this when I already have it on iTunes? Will it sound any better? Well, I got it, and I think you know the answer. Because when I put it on the turntable, I was skeptical as to whether it would sound better or worse or no difference at all from the iTunes version of it, and to my surprise, yes, there was a lot more detail on the record, because this is an original pressing, as it turns out, an original Canadian pressing. I did not know that at the time, so my mind wasn't colored or biased by that in any way. But when I put it on, it's not that there was like a whole new world of detail, but there was just more depth and more, I think, a wider sound stage to the music than there had been before, particularly on the strings. When you're listening to the record, you can really hear the strings being played, and there's a lot more lifelike detail to that. Versus on iTunes, it's there and it sounds like a real guitar, but it doesn't have that intimacy of sounding like you're in the room with, say, Steve Howe or any of the other musicians on there as they're playing it. So it's much more intimate, and as I later found out through Discogs, this is actually probably one of the first Canadian pressings that I have, that they made. So I was fortunate to get my hands on this because this was pressed in 1972, and apparently that's one of the first editions that came out in Canada, because we got it I think a year after it was pressed in the States for some reason. So yeah, it has the original wax number SD7211, and so yeah, I got really lucky. As I said, I mentioned that I found it in a record shop. It's a really great local independent record store owned by an ex-hippie who's very, very mellow and knowledgeable about his records. Accepts only records that are in good condition. So when I played it, it was in very nice condition. No hisses or pops or anything like that. So very nice. The album, of course, starts out with Roundabout, which is just an amazing song, as I said. And this album was really one of the first records produced that really took advantage of a new technology, and that was 24-track recording. Before, they had used things like, I think, before that it had been 8 or 12-track. And with 24-track recording, they could layer a lot more things, spread instruments out more, and do a lot more creative things with their sound composition and create a lot more dynamic compositions. And it really showed here. This really set the benchmark, because when you listen to this, there's a lot of detail and it's all really crisp and vibrant throughout the record. And this is also the first album that Yes made with the keyboardist Rick Wakeman, who would become a legend of rock music. He came on board after Tony Kaye left the band. So some of this was recorded with Tony Kaye, the old keyboardist who was on the Yes album and I think a couple of others. And the rest was with Wakeman. Now, at the time the band had an idea for Fragile that they would each record a song that they had an idea for and which focused on them. But Rick Wakeman, because he had just come on board and was still contractually with another music label, couldn't compose for the band just yet. So he had to create a piece that had already been written. So he did one that he called Cans and Brams, which is the second song after Roundabout, which is a 1.5 minute piece where he just does a segment from Brahms' symphony, and really creative and interesting, but it's also really interesting to hear about the politics that went into recording the record, like the idea of having someone in your band who's a full member but who contractually isn't allowed to record anything new or compose anything new is very strange. So yeah, very interesting. So yeah, the first side of the album is, of course, very vibrant and very dynamic and engaging. We go from Roundabout to Cans and Brams, which is really bubbly and upbeat. Then we have Heaven, which is a strange, weird choral piece, which the lead singer, John Anderson, who has a really recognizable voice, recorded just by overdubbing himself several times, chanting, "We have heaven," and other things over and over again. And it's really weird and really cool to listen to. And then, of course, the fourth song is another epic called South Side of the Sky, which I wasn't familiar with when I first listened to it, but I really quickly fell in love with, because this is it's a really great example of a progressive rock song with a lot of influences. Not only is it like a very long classically influenced song, but it also has a lot of touches of metal, or what would become metal later on. Very heavy and hard rocking at the same time as being classically influenced as well. So really, really cool composition, and really fueled by different influences. So this is a band that could get really creative with their composition, and it really shows, and it's really enjoyable to listen to, and really great. Side 2 has a lot of other interesting songs on it. We have this one starts out with a little intro, I think it's by the drummer Bill Bruford, 5% for Nothing. Goes directly into one of their more famous songs, which is Long Distance Runaround, which is just really, really great, and really good showcase of Yes's composition and style, that can also be played on the radio because it's not too long. And then, of course, that segs seamlessly into a jam that Christopher Squire did called The Fish, which has become really popular among fans of Yes and of progressive rock in general, which is just where you have this bass line and jamming with guitars and keyboards and everything, and then the band just starts chanting the name of this fish, the Latin name for this fish, over and over again. It's really weird, but also really cool. They were into chanting on this album, I guess. The other thing I noticed about the original record that makes it better than iTunes is that there's no pause between these tracks. The original album was, of course, recorded without gaps or breaks in it, so that many of the songs flow seamlessly into one another. But when you download it on iTunes, they break it up. They split it up so that the tracks end in silence, and it's really awkward to hear that, especially when you compare the transition between Long Distance Runaround and The Fish, which is supposed to be seamless, but which they cut off really awkwardly in the iTunes version. So really, it's not the best version of the album to get it in. So I wouldn't recommend it. We also have Mood for a Day, which is a guitar piece by Steve Howe, and that really showcases the warmth and range of this recording, because you can really hear Steve Howe playing. You can hear his fingers on the frets, and it really sounds like he's in the room when you listen to it closely, and it's a very intimate experience and really lifelike. And then of course from there, Mood for a Day is really tranquil and nice. Then we go straight into Heart of the Sunrise, which closes the album and is really a different piece, because it starts out really intense and then goes quiet and then gets loud again, and so it's very jarring song, but also really cool, and really shows off the range that they were able to accomplish as a band. So really solid album, really great if you're interested in different and dynamic and instrumentally influenced music. I would really recommend this. So, oops, I put it in the wrong way. But I wouldn't recommend trying to make too much sense out of John Anderson's lyrics, because really, when you first hear them, they don't make a lot of sense, and when I first couldn't make sense of them, I thought maybe it was just me not understanding them, but here they're printed on the inside, and they don't make any more sense as it is. Now, you could say that John Anderson was just a bad songwriter, but maybe he was just very transcendental, because when you read some of these lyrics, dream on to the heart of the sunrise, sharp distance, how can the wind with so many around me, lost in the city. It seems almost influenced by Joyce and by other modernist writers who would just kind of like invent their own structures. It kind of reminds me of things like Ulysses or other things that really played with words. So it could be nonsense, or it could just be really weird transcendental stream of conscious writing. Or it could just be the drugs, who knows. But anyway, whatever you think of that, the music on this is really great, and I would definitely recommend you checking it out. And of course, we also can't forget to talk about the artwork, because this is, of course, Yes was famous for its artwork by Roger Dean, and this is one of his greatest and most famous examples of this painting of a surreal planetscape, which really cool and really adds to the appeal of the album. Very bright and lifelike and surreal, and really reflects the mood of the album. You see the ship there and everything. And yeah, really cool, and really showcases what the advantage is to having a large cover on a vinyl record are, because you can really show off your artwork and really make it into a work of art. Of course, you can see artwork on iTunes, but then it's just a thumbnail, so it doesn't really capture it. But yeah, so should give credit to Roger Dean there. And our next record is Emerson, Lake and Palmer's first album, titled Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So yeah, Emerson, Lake and Palmer is a progressive rock band that I only got into recently, as I mentioned in one of my previous videos when I talked about getting brain salad surgery in the mail. I guess at my age, if I couldn't understand Yes at that time, I definitely wouldn't have been able to understand the things that these guys did, because this is even more out there than Yes was, I would say. But anyway, Emerson, Lake and Palmer was probably one of the first rock supergroups, because it took three established musicians and insanely talented musicians, Keith Emerson, Greg Lake, who does the vocals and has an amazing voice, and Carl Palmer, who is just an amazing drummer in every sense of the word, And of course, Keith Emerson, I forgot to say, is the keyboardist and is an amazing one at that. So the three of these musicians, basically in 1969 or 70, were in three different bands. Keith Emerson was in a band called The Nice. Greg Lake was in King Crimson when they started out. And Carl Palmer was in a band called Atomic Rooster, which I can't hear or read the name of without kind of chuckling to myself. But anyway, I'm sure they did good things. But yeah, they got together and their talents really meshed completely, and they decided to form their own group called Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which became known as ELP and became extremely successful during the 70s. So this is their first album. The first album to showcase Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which I only got recently. It was actually a birthday present. I started listening to this a while back. I stumbled across it on a streaming service and on YouTube, and kept listening to it primarily for Lucky Man, which is on this record. It's the last song on there, and one of their most famous ones, probably one of their most accessible ones. And I really liked Lucky Man. I would listen to it a lot, and so that led me to kind of start listening to the rest of the album. And then finally, I decided I'd like to have the whole album and just experience it. So, because that's what you do with music, is you experience it. So because my mom's awesome, she decided to get it for me, and she got it for me on vinyl at the same independent music store that we really like. And there's actually an interesting story to that as well, because when my mom actually called and asked the guy at the store if he had it, it was an extreme coincidence, because that same day, that very morning, someone brought this one in and asked if he would buy it. And so he decided to bring it, and so he decided to buy it off him because it was in good condition, and didn't know if anyone would sell it. And just a few hours later, my mom called and asked if he had the album, and he was actually really freaked out because it was such a really quick turnaround and a coincidence. So that was really freaky when I heard about that. It's almost like this was meant for me. But that's really cool, and it is a really cool and great album. So this is the record that really introduced Emerson, Lake and Palmer to the world. But before that, they did a really famous live show that I'm not sure was recorded, but it really got them started, and that's what secured their record contract with Atlantic Records. But anyway, this was their first album as a band, and really showcases their style, or rather range of styles, because when you listen to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, they are progressive rock in every sense of the word, in the sense that they're progressive beyond any one genre. I don't think ELP can be confined to any one genre, because they always tend to combine genres. There's, from the first song, The Barbarian, which is really intense and really starts off pounding, to songs like Take a Pebble, which is next, and which goes on for a long time and goes into all kinds of quiet little solos and things. They go through a whole range of styles. They're combining jazz influences, lots of jazz drumming, which Carl Palmer does an amazing job at. Classical pieces in the keyboard work by Keith Emerson. Folk inspirations from Greg Lake in his lyrics and in his guitar playing, and just a whole fusion of all kinds of other things. So it's really hard to pin them down. They're really intellectual, really cerebral, and really jazzy. So at first it may not be the most accessible work, because you have The Barbarian, which is really intense, builds up to a really huge climax. Then you've got things like Take a Pebble, which starts off as a regular kind of like folk ballad, but then goes on for 12 minutes and has like this very strange, very quiet guitar solo, which is just Greg Lake picking away at strings for a while and barely audible. So lots of very strange, dynamic pieces on here. By dynamic, I mean a lot of difference between lows and highs on this record, because it's almost silent at certain points. Knife Edge, which is really intense and orchestral and gothic, closes out the side. This isn't an original pressing. I looked up the number on Discogs, KSD 19120, and it is actually a 1977 reissue. So the original record was released in 1971. This is from 6 years later, but it is on the original label, Caution, which is an imprint of Atlantic Records, as it turns out. And as I noticed, there's a Q on the dead wax here somewhere. On the opposite side of the number there's a Q imprinted there, and I'm not sure what that means. It could be an initial of the engineer or the person who mastered it, but I don't know. So, I don't know. If someone knows, please tell me, because I couldn't find out. So side 2 of the record starts off very gothic and very dark with a classical piece that Keith Emerson wrote called The Three Fates, which basically starts out with a concert organ and basically progresses into a lot of different piano works and jazz influences and really a lot of styles. I really shouldn't have called it classical because it's very all over the place, but very interesting and certainly progressive in the sense that it's not very much like traditional rock and roll at all. For Tank, then we have Tank, which is awesome because that is the song that showcases Carl Palmer's drumming style and particularly the jazz stylings of the band very well. There's a really cool 3-minute solo about in the middle of this where Palmer is just allowed to go wild. Then we have all that synth goodness at the end as well with when the rest of the band comes in. And finally, the last song on the record is the one that most people will know if they've heard of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which is Lucky Man. This is probably my favorite song on the record, even if it's the most accessible or mainstream. It's still my favorite because I'm not just some hipster who only likes things that aren't popular. So yeah, basically this was composed by Greg Lake. I think when he was 12 he actually wrote this, and it's just an incredibly beautiful and somber song, a ballad for someone who died in the military, and really the harmonies and the composition, the guitar work, the synth work, the drum work, they all come together really well on this song. And even though it's probably the shortest song on the record, it really showcases all the band's talents really, really well. And I can just listen to it. I've just listened to it a lot because it's really one of those songs that grabs you. So I really recommend that, even if the rest of the record isn't accessible to you. It's also really cool for the very interesting synth solo, the Moog solo at the very end of it, which is a lot different from other keyboard solos, but still really cool and really interesting. Yeah, so that is the record that introduced Emerson, Lake and Palmer to the world and really started them off on their course to fame. Maybe it's not their best record. I think they got a lot tighter in composition later on as they progressed from records like Tarkus and Pictures of an Exhibition to their really big work, Brain Salad Surgery, which I talked about before. But yeah, either way, still a good record and a really strong record. Maybe not the most accessible record. I know like there are some people who like complain about prog rock because it doesn't rock hard enough. It's not really rock. It's just a mixture of everything, and it's not really anything. And I get annoyed by people like that because at the same time there are people who, you know, complain about rock and roll because it's not like classical music. So some people will complain because it's not like classical music. Some people will complain because it's not like rock music. You can't please everyone. So these are people who were just really great musicians and really inspired musicians who really wanted to just do their own thing. And I think that passion and that talent really comes through here, and I admire them for that. So, and I really like the cover art here, because here you've got this dove that's coming out of a person's ear and brain, and I think that's really cool, because it's like, it's music that stimulates your ear and your mind and your soul, maybe. That's my kind of artsy interpretation of what this cover is. And really great work by Nick Dartnell. Nick Dartnell was the one who painted this. And as you can see, this is before their classic ELP design, which came about on the cover of Brain Salad Surgery, so that wasn't there yet. So, those are my 2 cents on those records. If you have a chance, really, you should definitely check them out if prog music is your thing. And if not, well, at least you can say you tried something new. Anyway, well, it was good to have you along again, and hopefully we'll catch up next time. Thanks a lot for joining me. Happy Easter, folks. Hope you didn't pass out from all the sugar in those chocolates. Anyway, tune in next week for more musical goodness.